Good morning, friends of the Regeneration Podcast, fans of the Regeneration Podcast. We're glad to have you on board. Michael, this is the earliest for us. We'll talk to our guests in a minute. Earliest for us that we've ever recorded a podcast. It's 8 a.m. here in Eastern Standard Time.
Yes, it is. But I'm raring to go.
You're raring to go. Me too. And one of the things our guests and I talked about the topics today. It's going to be law. Our topic is the game of law and God, and we're going to get into that. But it was a case where the nature of this podcast, I came up with the topic, and I just been thinking about law for a while. It just weaves through my writing, but it's always or reading, I should say, but it's always in the background. And I picked up Jacques Ellul. He's a camarado, temperamentally well disposed to me and me to him. And he had a theological foundation of law book. It was all on natural law. And I just got a little ways in. I picked up Valentin Tomberg's books that are getting, coming out with Angelico Press. I forget the name of it, but he wrote a dissertation on jurisprudence. Yes. And I wasn't even forming the questions I wanted to ask about law at this point. And then
it's called regeneration in jurisprudence, by the way.
Yeah, you're right. But then I thought of exploring it with our guest this morning, who we've had on the show at least 3 times before, but he did professional training, was as a barrister, even though he's an artist, historian, novelist, writes a lot of books. Our guests, our fans know him. Welcome, James Tunney. How are you?
Great to see you, gentlemen. Sorry for getting you up so early. I hope my brain works in the midday here. I was thinking last time you were talking about the deer, and I forgot to say that our garden does be full of deer here, and they come in and I communicate with them, but I'm not going to reveal how I communicate with them because I know that there's hunters over there listening. I want to keep the secrets away.
James has this little time bomb secret, and it's right next to him on the shelf, and he won't show the listeners.
Well, it's great to see you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, Michael.
Speaking of law, gentlemen, I think I want to start with a short lyric. You probably heard this one before. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose, who steals the common from off the goose.
Wow.
Which is
I don't know the
that
author.
was a folk song that arose in England during the days of enclosure.
Yes.
And enclosure, I think, is a great example of what we're calling lawfare.
Yes. Yeah.
So and the more I think of, I wrote about this quite a bit in, I think it was Transfiguration, about enclosure, and because you see it happening, you see it happening here in Michigan, where in the United States, where they're trying to get inventories of even small farms, small 10-acre farms like us, like how many animals they want to see, how many animals they have. They want an inventory. Then they want to start tagging. They want to tell you which ones you can keep and which ones you can't keep, and then et cetera, et cetera. Then the other thing they do here in kind of rural Michigan, you'll see these subdivisions suddenly go up in farmland. Well, what the reason they do that is because they get real estate agents get on the municipal boards and change the zoning laws, which then causes these subdivisions to go up, which causes taxes to go up, which causes farmers no longer to be able to pay the taxes on their land, so they're forced to sell. So the real estate people gobble it up in the developers, and it's all done legally. It's all legal. And we think about this, lawfare in terms of what's going on. I know we're going to talk about what's going on in Ireland, which disgusts me to no end, but also see it with, the lawfare term here in the States comes up quite a bit in regards to Trump and the events, the strategies of the Democratic National Committee to keep him off the ballot, so keep him busy with lawsuits, often frivolous, and it's kind of crazy, right? But it's all legal though. It's all legal because the guys making the laws are rigging the game in their favor.
What a great beginning.
I'm really angry during this.
Yeah, no, welcome to the Regeneration Podcast. I was looking for a way to explore. What an excellent beginning, Michael. No better beginning. James Tunney.
Okay. Yeah, you get me going as well there. And coming from an Irish context, for hundreds of years, our view of law was antithetical towards the established law. So it's nothing new coming from an Irish perspective. To my expectations growing up were not fantastic. Remember that ongoing in Northern Ireland when I was young, the state were putting people in prison without trial and shooting them on the street. So we talk about the West and how liberal it is, but people have short memories in relation to how despotic the West is, but also what constitutes the West.
Super important point. Yep.
Well, and then my grandfather singing songs down there, and the police come, you weren't allowed to, as well as all the other stuff they were doing. The idea that we've had freedom of speech for a long time, especially in Ireland, is just a fantasy. It's not actually true. So in some ways, it's just same old in relation to takeover of Ireland, which is ongoing. My problem, and when you suggested a topic, I've tried to stay away from law for as much as I can, because there's other things to talk about first. But really, you're right in relation to the centrality of it. I don't want to start off with that topic first, the thing I know most about in a disciplined or technical sense. And I was always interested in the future of law. So anything that I studied, I was moving on to what's coming. And it got grimmer and grimmer, by the way.
Yeah.
But so in recent times, I'm trying to find a new way to explain to people what's going on, because I hear people already who are critical saying, I don't know where it comes from, or we've won, the game is over, they're on the run. And it's clear to me that they have no idea. Anyone that's saying that have not the least idea of
our
what's
friend
going
Guido
on.
Preparata would be saying you're 100% right, James.
Yeah. They have no idea what's going on. They have no idea what's coming. And they're in a game. So the game is very important idea here in relation to this. So instead of talking about, or in the context of talking about the law, we have to consider it as a game. And I talked to a famous psychiatrist years ago. He's dead now. He's a very intelligent man from Ireland, very informed man. And I asked him for his kind of clinical judgment in relation to his experience of the legal profession. And he said to me, it's a game, and I knew that, but it kind of shook me in some way, in a clinical sense, that the people he saw, the great professionals, were engaging in as a game. So this game context is important. And of course, both of you are very aware of our literary tradition. And I think it's why we should be looking back at literary tradition is to get some artistic signals about what the future is before they wipe it out. And of course, in this context, in relation to the game, we'd think of Thomas Mann and the glass bead game, which I think is a kind of critical description of the kind of intellectualism that goes wrong in many senses. And also, the Swiss connection is critical. Now, when I was thinking this morning, I was thinking about Switzerland as critical. If you want to know where the legal source of a lot of the rules and regulations are today, it's from Switzerland. And interestingly, of course, where is the Magic Mountain set in? It's set in Davos.
Davos.
It's quite incredible.
Right.
People focus on the World Economic Forum, but they don't know anything about the World Trade Organization, which has been changing the rules and making the legal regime corporate friendly for companies in the last 2 decades. So, for example, you see this graph always produced by people about the magical, inevitable, increase in computer outputs, and it shows a graph going up. And the implication of that is there's something magical, inherent, and vital in the way that computer chips are going. It's just inevitable. But they don't explain to you that happened for a very specific reason. In 1996, the Information Technology Agreement, coming from the World Trade Organization, Switzerland, which reduced to zero tariffs on 400 computer components, which explains why it was cheaper to produce something in Vietnam than it was in America. Tariffs. So there's specific institutional reasons. And when you look back, you have the World Health Organization, again, you're going to Switzerland, you had the pharmaceutical companies, you have the pharmaceutical companies base, some of the cases in Europe about price fixing and whistleblowing relate to Switzerland, the whistleblowers who talked about price fixing in Europe like the famous case with Stanley Adams, he's arrested in Switzerland and put in prison. It's as whistleblowers are, because he's ratting on the price fixing, the coordination between the companies across Europe. Pharmaceutical LSD comes from Switzerland. The World Health Organization, all the international organizations on migration, all the theories on migration, all the theories. We see the Swiss involved in this case in the European Court of Human Rights, which determines now that the state has to implement climate change in its laws. That was a Swiss kind of motivated. A recent proposal that was rejected in a conference in Nairobi in relation to geoengineering. The Swiss put it forward to have these geoengineering experiments, which are ongoing in the United States, which started
little
in the 60s
neutral
in Vietnam.
Switzerland, right?
Yeah. I want to make this point really clear. If people are saying, well, what's happened? Look at Switzerland. The international currency, the changes are, I believe, ongoing now. I think that it's being discussed and being worked out by the various financial centers, center of banking in Switzerland. The center of NGOs are in Switzerland. So what happened when the British Empire began to change and the Anglo-American Atlanticist organization of military power began to change, particularly after the Second World War, they began to use Switzerland as a base to send out all these organizations to change society. Ireland has been changed by NGOs. I heard someone on one of the mainstream media saying, oh, the Catholic Church used to be as powerful in Ireland as the NGOs are now. And they were saying that in a positive sense. It's true. They've used that to engineer. A lot of it comes from the United States as well. There are even subtler things. In future, I hope to explore a hypothesis that the Tridentine Mass and the source of the Tridentine Mass changes come from Switzerland. If you look at the early studies of Jung, for example, Jung was fascinated with the Catholic Mass. He wrote about very sophisticated way, very praising of it. And later on, he's in communication with Henry Murray, the OSS in the United States, when they're coming over here. And Henry Murray is also very interested in, and they knew about the power of the Catholic Church. And then we see a lot of the changes to St. Gallen Mafia, etc., as it's called, in relation to changes that coming from Switzerland. Now,
I hadn't thought of that until you said it just a second ago, but it's obvious.
It's not as if the Pope is surrounded by a Swiss guard or anything. No. When you think, I'm not saying anything about that, but the connections with Switzerland are very, very important. Of course, we go back to the Protestant Reformation, go back to Calvin, Zwingli, all the debates about transubstantiation is a Swiss connection. Now, Calvin wasn't as bad on some of the issues.
I haven't heard any of this before. That's wild.
Well, this is I'm trying to put it together for people to think about.
Who would have known? Switzerland.
So, two other points come to mind. Where was Frankenstein written?
On Lake Geneva.
How deep was that perception? You know what I mean? So really, if you look at a lot of the modernization force, and I'll give you another example, which set me off about Geneva years ago. But you know the way some things are in little things. I tend to listen a lot and pay attention and not get involved in arguments if I don't have to, so I can understand a bit more. And I went a number of times to Geneva because I was interested in the World Trade Organization.
I've been to Geneva. Yeah, I spent a lot of time, not a lot of time there.
The first head of the first Directorate General of the World Trade Organization was Peter Sutherland. Now, Peter Sutherland, of course, head of British Petroleum, Goldman Sachs, EU Commissioner, Competition Law. If he's not the greatest globalist or one of the greatest globalists, I don't know who was.
Peter Sutherland. I didn't know the name.
Yeah, Peter Sutherland. And there's a funny little connection because my uncle was a politician and he beat him in a local politician, and I kind of had a big effect on him, So,
wow.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm proud of that in retrospect. It was a divine sense. But when I was in Geneva, I remember talking to someone from an NGO. Now this was just at the end of the 90s. I was there a couple of times at the start of the 2000s. So at least over 20 years ago. And he said to me about someone in Ireland that I know. He said, "Oh, he's very right wing." And it was the first time I heard anyone using this language about
how big it's come,
politics in Ireland. So it set up. Hold on, and I was thinking about what I understood And I'd read everything about fascism and this, and I was saying, well, how could this person who was a conservative, just a conservative Catholic, how could that person be regarded as, and it was kind of far right, and it was utterly inconsistent with their political views. They can be conservative on cultural issues, but be very socialist in relation to the distribution of wealth, and this person was, and it registered already. And again, we see this direct spoke, or the hub, coming from Geneva. So the point I'm going to make to people is that all this stuff, whether Trump and Biden, if you think that anyone in the right mind thinks that Biden is running the United States, they need to get their head examined.
Right.
And likewise,
you can take that for granted as the editorial line of the Regeneration podcast.
And likewise with Trump, whether they, and again, who does Trump fill his thing with? I'm not a real anti-Trump or anything, but in relation to thinking, now one might be better than the other, that's a different issue. But in relation to thinking that it's going to deal with these issues, and certainly in relation to international trade, and that he has been better, although he seems to be reading off the script on Iran. But that's another issue. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But the point being is that he fills his cabinet with Goldman Sachs, the same Peter Sutherland, the same crowd. So the rules that are affecting your, and also other, like Gavi and all that, are based in Geneva. So you can walk around in the World Trade Organization. Across there is the World Intellectual Property Organization that organizes all the rules, for intellectual property, and then the World Health Organization, and then the United Nations Council on Refugees, and then UNCTAD, and then all these. It's all there, so you can walk between them. So if you want to pull the strings between them, we talk about convergence of technology, but we don't really talk about the convergence and coordination of the regulatory system. So what I'm saying is that through the construction of the EU, people didn't understand when they joined into the European Union. It clearly says from the 60s that you're pooling your sovereignty. So the idea that your sovereignty was retained is wrong as long as you're a member of the EU. And more, I thought this for years. I was involved at the highest level in some of this EU context. The last year, before I left academia, I was invited by the High Court of Beijing, the Chinese Academy of Social Science, to talk about these issues, and the European Academy of European Law. So I know about this stuff, but more and more, it becomes undeniable that the birth story of the EU is just false, and that there's no doubt that it was set up by the Atlanticists, by the secret services, through the Marshall Plan, etc. It nothing got to do with any organic movement in Europe, and its objective was part of the movement towards global governance. So the game is we're moving towards global governance. The construction of, that's the end. We're going to get, that's the means to the end. The object of the game, what you get when you win, is that you control human consciousness. That is the objective, the same objective that they would have said in medieval Europe about the demons trying to, it's the same objective. The objective of the people that get global governance is to be able to control the population through endosymbiosis with technology, so they control your soul and your spiritual consciousness. I have no doubt about that. And the reason why the pharmaceutical, if we find this convergence of pharmaceutical stuff, CERN, of course, is another, and the other organization.
I was going to mention that. That seems like
the
the elephant in the room.
The worldwide.
That's a hellhole of a country, boy. Yeah.
So then you say, well, it was Tim Berners-Lee came up. Come on, a network of it all comes back. So the objective of the big game, beside all the things behind the scenes, is to control human consciousness. Anything that stands in the way, the New World Order, as we know from H.G. Wells, the family, the nation state, and religion is gone. So all the religious systems go at some point. Now they may encourage Islam in order to set up an opposition with the remnants Christianity, and of course opposition to Islam, if it was powerful, would unite Russia, China, and the United States as they move with their single currencies, etc., toward a global system of coercion, unless they're going to double cross one of them, which they may do. So then in that context, the world makes sense. So if you get someone now, in fairness to Trump, he is being hit by this lawfare, and that's a good sign. People who are being hit by this lawfare is a
It's
sign
a feather
in their
in your
game.
cap.
I'm just saying that
Yeah.
his power is limited in whatever way because of these things. So
I think that
having been
passes the
said,
smell test. Yeah.
so there's lawfare against. You can see any figure that sets up, and that the evidence is coming out now about that. There are information coming out from whistleblowers and from undercover stuff that the CIA and FBI are open about their destruction of people. I mean, it's always gone on. It's
Well, I
clear.
don't know if you heard, James, but yesterday, something passed in the U.S. Congress, breaking the Fourth Amendment and allowing the FBI to not need a warrant to tap anybody's phone.
Right. That's how I was going to begin the show in one sense,
Yeah.
about these erosions of liberties,
And
liberties.
and it's like you said, it's out in the open. They don't care if anybody knows anymore, right?
No, right. Law is just a tool of power,
But listen on that point.
Yeah.
This is what Assange and Snowden were telling us. Every keystroke we do is recorded. The idea about the warrants and data protection is all nonsense. Everything we do electronically is recorded. The totality of it. So they only maintain a front in the front of the shop for certain things, but the new world order is here. This is what people don't understand, and I believe it really came into being going back to 1963. But it really coming now. The reason why it's becoming more evident in your face is because they believe that the mold, the die is being cast, that we've crossed the Rubicon, everybody's in, and all the systems are in place to take us over. So they're not that worried about coming in front, and they may be, in fact, be jockeying for positions in the elites that will emerge through this. We have the World Health Organization, I should have mentioned that, again, Geneva, setting up the network. This is what they call the network, which will go into your body. So these guys over there, undemocratic, beyond the power of the state, with contempt for religion, are deciding what will go in your body and the consequences for you and the children your grand. That's the directory. I don't know how to make it. I don't want to get lost in the detail of it. The lawfare is important. There's two elements to remember. It's clearly going on at the moment. You can even see you can see people that speak against it. If they don't disappear, they'll be engaged. There'll be something constructed. Schellenberger has had whistleblowing revealing about the cooperation, again, based in Britain in relation to censorship. We all know about that.
There's these people who show real bravery, and they're heroes.
Yeah. But the other thing about lawfare that people don't really understand is a bit subtler. They can see it from. I did some contracts internationally, the UNDP and others, and I was invited by various groups, UNESCO and all this, and talks about this. And I worked with the World Tourism Organization. These were all cutting edge areas that are a lot more interesting than doing kind of local stuff about, the farmer that crashed his bike coming home drunk or something like. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in the macro stuff to try and get a sense.
That's how your mind works. That's how you came out of the womb, the macro stuff.
Yeah. So
brand name.
So it was nice to be able to invite you to 5-star hotels and explain to people, etc., out in exotic places and that. So, but I left that behind for. But anyway, if you look at the big firms, the big accountancy firms, the big legal firms, they're all $100 billion companies, and they have extreme power. So if you're going up against them, they can destroy you like that. If they want to destroy you, they will destroy you. There's no doubt about it. The problem is that these big legal firms are the founders, particularly in the United States, were globalists. They set up these systems to establish the rules internationally, and they were globalists. Their disposition was Atlanticist, to establish rules. So most of these big firms have a huge incentive for spreading the rules. For example, I'll give you an example. I was meant to go. I didn't go to Saudi Arabia as part of preparing the legal system. Now, they have prepared a legal system to be tourist friendly. So that's why you have people going over to all the boxing matches in Saudi Arabia. So they changed the laws, and you can see Tyson Fury's wife there. She's not veiled up or anything, watching the boxing match, etc. So the international force, its objective is to make the same thing. The Tower of Babel, the one
What a
language.
great example. You always say
Sa-
such profound things as an
Sa-
offhand remark.
same rules.
Mhm.
So those technical rules, you know, if you go into a hotel in any country in the world, you have expectations of how it works, but people don't
Yeah.
understand where those rules came from, that they
Mhm.
were, you know, they were agreed. Another one, biggest one that I should have forgot about, based in Switzerland, the International Telecommunications Union, going back to the 1860s, going back to the time when, according to La Salette prophecies,
Wow. Yeah.
a legion of demons was released on the world. That's the
La
way
Salette,
I
yeah.
traced the timing to
Hmm.
it back there. Now, even there's another book, funny, about the Antichrist, George Dillon, and he talks about Geneva as well in the 1880s when the international
Hmm.
working unions were meeting in Geneva, and they made a big effort to separate the workers from the church and the Catholic teaching. It was a big effort in Geneva again. So that it is just look at and study. It's a small place. Look at study at what has come out of Switzerland, and we will
Mhm.
see what's happening. And so, what's the big thing that's where do you go if you want in Europe if you want to have a suicide, assisted suicide? You go to Switzerland,
Yeah.
Dignitas. Now here is another important point. So traditionally, the reason why Catholics are against the idea of this assisted suicide is because of a fundamental concept of the dignity of the human, and
Mhm.
Pope Francis has written about that recently. So what these organizations do, and these powers and these centers of power, is they take the exception and they make the exception the rule. This is another aspect of law that's very important. It's test case. I've seen this happen. I've heard some of the people, I'm not going to refer, talking in a gloating manner about this. I'm not going to get into details or personalize any of it. Say you want to change the Constitution. Say your Constitution has a provision which is against abortion. So there's a rule, is that extent. There is no abortion in this country, for example. And you want to change that. So what you have to do is go beyond and find some exceptional case. You find and construct an exceptional case. So the girl is raped by the father, whatever. Again, I'm not going into particular case, or some extreme case that any right-minded person would find difficult in the construction of the circumstances to go against.
And you used right-minded person. You're not saying wackos, right? Right-minded people could find it difficult, but it's the way it's used.
I mean, nearly everybody. I mean, 90%. Even people that had profound views on who would say,
I think that's important.
This I can't. So so you take that, and there is. It's like the Shakespearean. One of the actors, I think it was Laurence Olivier, described Shakespeare's writing as characters. We have all these in the tragic figures. We have this great statuesque figure, but they always have their hamartia, which is like a fissure, a crack that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And this same philosophy and deconstruction is there as well. So we take the exception and we say, okay, in this case, it's justified, and then that expands. So very, very soon there's a replacement, and the exception becomes the rule. Right. This is the technique. It's inversion. Goes everywhere, on and on. So now, what's the big? So if Sweden or Switzerland is leading the way on euthanasia, you must have noticed in the last few months, in the last year, that euthanasia is the next big thing. I've heard people that I know, ordinary people, say, "Oh yeah, I feel sorry for those people," and and the Dignitas, of course, is the name of the organization, Switzerland. Now. I'm not criticizing anyone. I'm not in extreme circumstances. We know that it's palliative care and all that kind of stuff. But the reality of euthanasia is, if we look in Holland, according to the figures, that most people don't consent to it. That someone else makes a decision. That euthanasia is being offered to children. That euthanasia is being offered in Belgium and other places. That euthanasia is being offered in Canada for people that are poor.
Canada's a good example.
Has been offered, or to mentally handicapped people. So we're going strangely back to the Nazis' position with their ideas of eugenics and informed by the British. We have that, and it's getting wider and wider. So again, euthanasia is another Swiss-led thing. Oh, nice, clean, medical. So we're crossing in Ireland at the time of this recent thing on the family. Of course, the objective is to get rid of the family from the Constitution. It didn't work, thankfully. The people are beginning to wake up a little bit. But they're already talking, gloating in anticipation. Well, now we have to have euthanasia. We have to have big boys. We've had abortion, homosexual marriage, all this kind of stuff. And now we have to have euthanasia, the debate about euthanasia, you know. So, it's not sufficient that the Irish indigenous population of Ireland is going down relatively, and that they have no rights relative to the superior rights of, which I don't like about the recent statement of the Pope in relation to this concept of dignity. Here's another concept I want to put out into the ether. I talked about this in the 90s, and I failed in the 90s in my academic career to in many ways to make some of the big points. But one of the points that I saw in Ireland, and I tried to explain to people, they didn't get it, they weren't interested, was the idea of the ghost host. And this is a very important concept. That the implication of if you take UNESCO, so UNESCO says, what's great, World Heritage, you know, the Newgrange in Ireland is World Heritage Site. That's fantastic. What does it say? It says now that this place that was, or other places that were protected by the people or belonged to a particular community or in the context, they are now owned universally. They are the universal heritage, and other people have the rights to manage these places. You know, so this is so what happens in a number of these things, and it was in tourism that I talked about, and I was invited to the Holy Land in the context of the development of an ethical code on world tourism, and again, I was against a lot of it because a lot of them give superior rights to the outsiders. It goes away from ideas of Aquinas and that about the importance of locality, and it gives a superior right to the person coming in. So, for example, the object of this, I said, and the object of the European Union, or the effect of it, would be that the community would become a ghost in its own place. The host would become a ghost in favor of a other group which is projected into it. Now, this is a deeper concept. And I wrote that in the literature, but again, nobody paid any attention to it. And that is happening. But there is a much deeper element to it. And it's related to the, going back to the assault, coming from Britain, Huxley, and also it's a deep in a Protestant scientific Baconian view, and also in certain philosophical views, is that this is being applied to consciousness. The same idea means that you, Mike, don't have any free will. It's just a construction. You don't have any superior divine construction. You are not made in the image of God. That's only psychological. You have no intrinsic thing. In fact, we're moving. We used to allow you to worship God, and then we got more humanist. And then who's the great humanist? Julian Huxley. Transhumanism, and now we're post-humanism. Transhumanism is history. So actually, you're a bit of a burden, you know. So you know, and as well, you get a bit old there. So
this is it.
The euthanasia is a perfect thing for you, and it goes on like that. And if you don't want to, we'll change you, or you can take this thing and be cognizant and consistent, and so I mean, what the implication of this in a deep sense is that the human is being turned into a hungry ghost in esoteric terms. And to finish off this point, that one's consent to it will allow one become a hungry ghost. So I heard that I didn't know who the boy was, Cat Williams, that comedian that was going on about, you know, and he said, you're either on God's side or you're on the other side, you know. And one of the key points is all legal regulation, all constitutions really ultimately, going back to the codes of Hammurabi in ancient Babylon, they claimed authority from God. Moses is doing jurisprudence. He is trying to take what he perceives as the divine, or perceives the divine, and instrumentalize it. Well, these are the rules of the game of life. Just don't kill them. Just don't rob them. And you know, that's not much to ask. Whereas a lot of the new age kind of things is, well, I don't like the dogma. Which bit do you not like? We have to challenge the people. Which bit do you not like? Is you're okay with the killing, is it? Well, I have asked the people. I said, is it the stealing you know you have a bit of a problem with? And they seem to have, well, I don't know, maybe they were people come from socioeconomic, no problem with that. So I mean, the point is, people say, well, I'm agnostic, not understanding what the word means, that they have to prove any spiritual thing to the scientific people, according to Huxley, or they're atheists. Fair enough, choose that. But you get nothing in there to give you a legal regime that's going to protect your fundamental rights.
There's nothing
They're
in
saying
there. There's nothing beyond
not only
the
do you
human.
have no rights, you're not a human. There's no such thing. This is what they're telling us. If we go back 30 years, we wouldn't have believed. And I read the literature coming out legally early on about transgenderism. I don't want to go into that, but who would have believed that people couldn't tell the difference between a man and a woman these days? Very soon, you won't be able to tell the difference between a human and a non-human. This is the problem. Is that a human? Are you human racist? Are you a speciesist? Sorry for going on so long, but you set me
No,
off.
it's true. Now, you know, I don't know if you saw it, Mike, but I wrote in my Substack the other day about the 1932 movie Freaks.
I hadn't read that one yet.
And well, in there, I mean, I was talking about precisely what James is getting at here. I mean, what we have in the current political milieu in the West, in particular, is a kinder, gentler kind of eugenics. It's not like the Nazis did. They're not going to line people up and shoot them and drop them into a hole. They're doing the eugenics long game.
Yeah.
And as James said, transhumanism is a part of that.
Flies trapped in honey.
And who's pushing transhumanism?
Right.
You know, the World Economic Forum. Whereas 20 years ago, when I published an article about it in a scholarly journal, as a warning, people thought, like James said when he was writing in the 90s, no one was paying attention, or they thought I was insane or exaggerating. And I wasn't exaggerating, because it's here right now. And I tell this other story. So this is probably sometime in 2012, right before we found out about the NSA building all these sites to collect data, right? So like James said, you know, what do you mean? Phone tapping. They've been doing it for a long time, right? Now they're just coming out in the open about it. But I was talking to a friend of mine, Martin, who at the time had like a alt news service online, an alt news, and he would ask me to write things for him once in a while. And he had been in the Foreign Service when he first got married, so like 35 years ago, and he was in Greece. But I was talking to him on the phone, and because he's really politically astute, and I was asking, what do you think's going on with Obama or whatever I said. And he just stopped me. He said, Michael, I just want you to know there are people listening to this phone call. and we know they are. And this is 2012. And that's right. And I'm sure James knows about this guy. That's right.
Is it actual listening, or is it still like a step removed where a machine's recording it, so it's there for somebody?
They're collecting it, and they have it for when
they're both essentially the same thing, but it's a distinction with a difference.
But this was maybe a week before William Binney came out with his whistleblowing of the NSA and doing this exact thing, right? And they collect that stuff in case you get on the radar, then they go through all your stuff.
I love how, like yesterday, when they're repassing this tyrannical surveillance bill, that they say congressmen, we're drawn in to secret, for documents that are under lock and key to show that this same surveillance has protected American lives. So we're going to jack it up. And then the congressmen get to walk out of a room. So friends, fellow citizens, I can't tell you about it, but it's really dark. And so we're going to need to take away more of your liberties, right? And now they just do it so shamelessly out in the open. And one thing, James, because you're great at tying things in, is all those ways when you were using the image of Switzerland, a pretty large coat hanger too that I was thinking a lot of them could be tied into is like the primacy of trade law, right? It's almost like antecedent trade law, that we had all these things that were there before we thwapped on like the Constitution, you know, and is there truth to that when you hear people talk about trade law, like the exploitation for good and ill? You know, some people would say the royals and so forth, you know, but is trade law a pretty big one? You know, I thought it was almost like the main arterial system of this type
Oh yeah,
of stuff.
there's no question. What I wanted to do years ago, and again, there's a few things I wanted to do years ago, and nobody said, well, what's the point in that? For example, the library, or not the libraries, the universities in Britain had the first kind of networks really that you could use, you know, for communication. And I said, well, I wanted to set up a legal journal. And I did set it up initially, but it went nowhere because you needed technical support, where you'd have interviews and you could go and back and listen to them. So it was the podcasting, but people say, well, why would you want to do that? You know, so anyway, and I did early on in the 90s use satellite, you know, for teaching other people up in Arctic Circle and things like that. But trade law is critical. So I did also teach in St. Andrews in the International Relations Department, deliver a course in law. And my argument was the undercurrent in that was that you're making a mistake believing that it's about international realism, as they call it. This state's interest, this state, nonsense. Commercial interests, corporate interests are critical. You have to understand them. And here's another thing that they don't understand.
That's big. Yep.
So we can sit and talk about any number of people. We could have a discussion. You could pick them out, and we'd be able to, you know, riff on that we'd be common from our having studied literature and theology or something. This is some figures more than others. But what if I say, tell me about the personality of the Hoffmann-La Roche company? Now, people talk about egregores and all these. They love all these stuff, but we're talking about actual entities that function as entities, independent of the personalities that survive. And they have legal personality. That means they can enter into agreements and have obligations, etc. The world is run by these big entities, but nobody can describe them. They have no sense of what they do. If we look, of course, at the history of politics in South America and say, well, here's this state, this happened, this was the, and then we look behind and we say, well, you know, the origin of Banana Republic and United Brands and the companies that changed all this. So it was the companies that were ruling the thing. We know about when corporations rule the world, but we have no grasp of the ability to visualize, to interpret, to imagine, to understand how they're behaving, where their malevolence is, or in Jungian terms, how they operate as, or to take his idea, as autonomous, kind of archetypal things on their own. Right. And these are the things that are ruling the world. And these are the things that people can distance themselves from. Oh, well, this is the company, but I'm only doing this. I'm only filling out this. Now, another principle which underlines the Nuremberg.
That's just one interjection. That's like techno-fascism, right? The similarities between I'm just doing this is directly analogous to the bureaucrat that Hannah Arendt talked about, who was filling out forms in triplicate, putting on people, you know, in trains to go to Dachau or something, you know, that type of
but it's
thing.
Also,
but we're all implied
communism
now.
as well.
Right,
it's the same. So I mean, it's tech totalitarianism. It's the same bureaucratic. Now, when you mentioned about the itinerary of, you know, the farms and all this, we can't be surprised about this, because if we go back to the Doomsday Book, I have a copy of you know, an extract from it there, which is big. In 1086, the Normans come to Britain, key drivers in a lot of this modern world. And what do? They send out all the people, and they come to your farm, and it's there. I can tell who had how many hides on the farm, how many cows they had. In 1086, everywhere, all over the thing. In 1086, they did it.
Wow.
Why was
that's wild?
Why was Jesus born in Bethlehem?
Tell me.
They're moving around, you know, the census, etc.
Yeah, right.
The idea that we have IBM and the Holocaust. How did the Nazis know where to get the Jews from? How did they know that there was 5 Jews in the South?
Yeah.
Because the punch card system that they put a question in the census. Now think of all the information that we have given up voluntarily. It's not, you know, I mean, it's not even that they can just bang us in prison. They can. It's funny as well about prisons in the United States. 2 million population, 5 million under supervision. And the center of it in this increasingly supposedly secular scientific world are the penitentiaries. The penitentiaries, you know, explaining a corruption, a distortion of the exceptional situation that existed to help people become penitent in the past. It's kind of comical. So that intensive surveillance now is coming into your consciousness. It's like it's like we have the heart of darkness, and they're going up the rivers into the heart of darkness. That's your consciousness they're coming into. And the way, of course, they're doing it is with the niceness of Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This was really on the ball about
yeah, it was,
Nurse Ratched.
it was.
Oh, you need to take your medicine now. We don't want to upset people. You know, it's just for your own good. She's behind glass and masks and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's Ivan Illich, and it's
very much
as another way it's called as well as death by doctor. The medical system is killing us. It's going to kill us. It's part of. And here's another insidious thing. Last point. Insidious thing about this, and I don't think people have realized this. In a totalitarian system, to make it work, I want you, if I'm the boss, I want you to be doing the dirty work, even though you're a nice guy. I want you to be involved in it. Once you're involved in it, your hands are dirty, well then, you know, it's difficult for you to get out. So notice in this system, with experimental, which we won't go into all the details of that, but experimental things, excess deaths and all, notice how many people who are not really medical professionals who did that all the time were involved in the system. And a number of people told me, oh yeah, I've been firing out this stuff. And I'm thinking, hold on, you're not going to be looking for, you know, you're not going to be looking critically at the evidence of the consequences of your action. And this is the way a totalitarian system. And in fact, you're going to be more incentivized to look at the evidence which says that it was a good thing. And you're not going to be objective about this. So we're in a totalitarian system. And now we're facing the World Health Organization networks that override and will override. And also the supposed organic migration means that the West is falling. The United States is, you know, you don't have to be a genius to work out what's happening. Ireland is a different place. I come from old Ireland. It's a different place. You know, good luck to it, but it is different. We can't ignore that. Sweden is a different, but the world has changed. But this is only the start of it. And so all these things suit the agenda. They suit the agenda of what? A global governance system, as I explained, the plantation of automatons run by AI, right down into your head with the capacity. So now if we have the highest thing, climate change, we say, oh, listen, Michael, on the climate change analysis, I'm sorry to say, we're going to switch it off. Bye-bye. Thanks. It's been good. You know. I mean, this is the reality.
We're experiencing it even on this show. We experienced that. It's getting weird. I told Michael about an email I got the other day that wasn't like a warning, but it was still, it was letting me know they know. Yeah.
Well, that's the other thing. When they bring those senators into the room, they say, "Oh, listen here, come here. I just want to show you these photographs we got. Someone's trying to blackmail you." You know, yeah. And also, this Wi-Fi. It seems there's evidence that it can show exactly what's going on inside your house through the rays. So everything you do is visible with this Wi-Fi. So I mean, and this again, this has been anticipated. We know that's happening. That makes me believe more and more that the antithesis or the hatred of Christianity, for example, the hatred of God, is for a good reason, because it is the opposing force, and that in relation to, as I've tried to explain before, in the Christian story in particular, not story in the Christian events, that is an anticipation of this, an anticipation of the consequences of accepting a reduction of ourselves. And we listen to people. I listened to Jordan Peterson discussing with Dennett, who I'm not impressed with, but he was very, he was kind of nice, mild-mannered in this context.
Who's Dennis?
Daniel Dennett.
Oh, Daniel Dennett. Yeah.
And he was saying, I say we've moved on now. All this God, so we don't need that, because ethics comes from secular thought, but it doesn't. The history of
No,
Europe, that is another critical point. The law in Europe, or conception in the United States, is an entirely Judeo-Christian construct, informed with the pagan systems that were there. When you're talking about your jury, which are 12 men or women, for example, come on, swearing an oath to tell truth. And if we look at some of these figures, for example, now I don't want to go too hard, but Jordan Peterson at the time of the Kavanaugh trial, when you come down to nuts and bolts, remember at the time of the Kavanaugh trial, he said that the man should resign when they presented all this evidence at the hearing. I found that very, very strange. The same as he said in relation to the
which part of the trial? So
the hearings, the Senate hearings when they're going through. There was a tweet, I think, from Peterson when this evidence began to come through, and he said, well, he should resign. I think the best thing. I said, hold on a second, this is inconsistent with a presumption. Where is the consistency on that? And similarly, in relation to the bit where he says, leave me alone and give me the old thing. You say, well, hold on a second, that's not consistent. My theory about him is, first time I saw him, my insight was this man wants to come up with a simulacrum theory story of God that will serve. That was my and he seems to be doing this. It's not the real. Everything is becoming the simulacrum. They're saying now they're going to create God. And that last point, we have agnosticism and atheism, but the real thing is Prometheanism. This is the real driving force. The Promethean project, Feinberg, it's in all the stuff. It's in all the AI theories. Now, they're very, very clear and consistent with Arthur C. Clarke, consistent with H.G. Wells, consistent with Marx. They're very, very clear. They don't say that God doesn't exist. They say, why should God force it? Why should God have this power over us? They reject the God or the gods, and they want to put themselves in the position. But most of them don't deny that there is a superior force. This is what Arthur C. Clarke, if we sneak back at this universal language, then we go back to the position we were in the Tower of Babel, or we can sneak back into the Garden of Eden, Francis Bacon, but true knowledge. So it's not that they're denying that God exists at all, and many of the theistic Satanists
that's more common
are quite clear on that. So a lot of people don't realize that their apparent neutrality is not neutrality. It's a choice of the other side, as that comedian Cat Williams said. I apologize if I'm banging on.
No, we love the fire. We love the fire.
I think this is absolutely timely too, because finally yesterday, the edition I wrote the introduction to of Nobalis's Christendom or Europe just came out, and that was it. I was really, my publisher, I love him because he'll ask me to write an introduction for Thomas Traherne or for that. It's like my favorite projects. And in writing that introduction, I had to dig in. Well, I found myself compelled to dig into the history of the EU. And I think this is absolutely connected to what you're talking, because as far as I'm concerned, and this is as I concluded my introduction, the EU is a kind of a demonic parody of Christendom.
Sure.
And in fact, do you know the flag or the seal for the EU with the blue field with the stars and the circle? That's a parody of the Woman of Revelation, crowned with stars, and this is why my friend John Milbank used to be really I don't think he is anymore, but for a while there he was really he defended the existence of the EU because he thought it was,
was he more pro
kind of an almost secular but well-meaning secular attempt at Christendom?
Yeah,
but that's not how it worked out. That's to me, from what I can tell, the EU is basically they made the job of the World Health Organization, the World Trade Center, the other one, they made that easier for them. Because if you had all those separate states in that small, in Europe with their own currencies and all this other stuff, that would make it a lot more difficult to impose these laws. And actually, who predicted this too was Vladimir Soloviev in the narrative of the Antichrist, where he This is back in 1900, where he predicted the United States of Europe. So, and as something that helps the Antichrist to come to power, consolidating power.
Yeah. Sorry, Mike, did you have something to say?
No, you go, James.
Okay, to continue on that point. So again, I went to and did a master's in London, where I had access to some of the greatest professors in these areas, intellectual property, in world context, and in the LSE and Queen Mary College and the UCL and that, and they were the leaders in these international areas. So I was very, and I set up a degree program in European law. So, and I was involved in the organization. I set up a European network. So I was, open to what was going on, and invited by various groups and publishing at the highest level on EU law. So I know a bit about it. And I was always, the students at the end of the course used to say, which I thought was good, well, are you for or against it? It wasn't my job to politicize them. And it's taken me a long time to work out, in a real sense, not just in a pick up a conspiracy thing, but in a real sense, what's behind it. And my belief now is that the EU was set up by the US, but I also believe that the US never escaped from the control of the British Empire. So it's a combined thing. And all of so I've said the key points in understanding the New World Order are London in the late 19th century, and I've written about that, and I've written about that in a recent book on post-humanism. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, the area around Russell Square. I have a chapter on it in the book. And then I was thinking about The Diabolist, which by G.K. Chesterton. And I didn't notice that had occurred in Russell Square at the Slade Art, or just up the Slade Art School as well, when he's saying that this guy, hold on, this guy knows there's good and evil, and he's choosing evil. This is the point. This is the point. The people are not doing it by mistake. They're choosing it and deliberately doing so. They're going to convince you that you're doing good by doing evil. That's the inversion. That's the exception and the rule. That's the upside down. That's the classic thing. De Valera, who did the Irish Constitution, which had the concept of dignity before the United Nations Convention brought in legally this concept, but he had it in the Constitution. In 1955, he went to a meeting in Strasbourg, and he realized what was happening, and he said Ireland can't be involved in any of these things. Already they're talking about socialist factions and this, that, and the other. And he was against Ireland joining the EU because of giving away his sovereignty. He's regarded, they regard him as a traditional old fool, but he was the one that brought Schrödinger to Ireland. He was one of the ones that could understand the theory of relativity design and came out. He was a very shrewd man, whatever way they blackened his name. I said to you before, I met him when I was a boy, and my family were interested. And some of them left his party, and anyway, another story. But so he saw it, and he saw that Ireland couldn't exist in this context, and he asked why, in a speech in the 50s, why would we give up our members of the British Empire, or fight against it to give away authority to another? But here is the difficulty. Here's the difficulty, and it comes back to, this is the difficulty that I have with the church. If Ireland had maintained its independence, whatever degree it had, it could have maintained its heritage, its spiritual heritage. It couldn't have been subject. But it was encouraged to do so by the Catholic Church. John Paul II was a driving force in the EU. Now, I have a lot of respect of course, for John Paul II and his writings and his personalism. I'm very, very close to that. But what Malachi Martin's caution was that John Paul II did not understand the geopolitical thing. He took a gamble. The gamble was that he understood, and he talked about in the 70s in America, that we're coming into the New World Order, and people don't realize that, and the end of Christianity. So it was a kind of gamble that you do in a card game. Sometimes you say, well, I don't know, my options are great, I'm going to try this card. The card was to put a lot in with the EU and then have a conciliatory view with the Marxists from the Soviet Union, which Malachi Martin charts about the connection between Marxism and the church. And hence you get the change in the church. So Malachi Martin objection to him, now remember Malachi Martin, wide education and the Jesuits and PhDs, and he's not a man whose intellectual views should be dismissed. He was very, very clear that the church was being taken over and that the European Union facilitated this. And he laid that out in one of his books on that. So there is a big, now you could call that a tactical failure or a strategic failure, but it was a massive failure in relation to
use the word gamble. Use the word gamble.
That's the most charitable way. Most charitable way.
As Michael knows, Guido's book Empire and Church talks about other gambles it's taken in the 20th century that were, holding its cards with the gamble. Interesting.
And here, so now it's taken me a long time being in it to understand the geopolitical thing, and also I had a privileged position, not because of the color of my skin, but because my family were involved. So I remember members of my family who are very close to some of these things, very close. Ireland is very small, and it was involved in some of these big things, connections with America, connections with Britain, connections with, and I remember them telling me about big figures, saying that person, talking to my uncle who was involved in, and he said, that person, celebrate, I'm not going to go into who it was, that person is a fraud, and kind of, is he, it was kind of shocking in relation to, or that person, who I knew, a big public figure, that person is a communist, and I'm kind of saying, is he, because you're told all the Reds under the beds, all this thing, it's kind of fantasy, and history has proven him right, and that was from the horse's mouth, as and absolutely authoritative to me. So I've seen this thing going on. People saying, "Oh well, Ireland was taken over, 5 years ago, maybe, or maybe back in 2012." It's a whole other story. A lot of what we think we know is a whole other story. Without going into major issues, that
this might sound weird. But a microcosmic example of that, I think, is what happened to Bono. Remember,
interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
I mean, Bono, because you look back because Bono and I are the same age. He might be 6 months older than I am, but when they came out, I was so impressed with here were kids who played decent rock and roll, but who openly professed Christ in a sincere way in a world that didn't like it. But then somehow he transitioned from that. They were anti-war. Somehow he transitioned from that to being the cheerleader for the war in Ukraine and being Bill Gates' best friend. How did that happen?
I might not have known how bad he's gotten. Yeah.
It's bad.
Yeah, really bad. Wow.
Well, I've never met the man, but he's. It'd take me a quarter of an hour to walk to his house from my house in Dublin. He's from the same area, the little bit posher area. Now, here's a question. It's just a simple question of fact. You know him that long. What religious group is he attached to?
I can't remember what it's called, but it's not conventional.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a funny thing. Here's not a funny thing. If my analysis of the origin of the global force is correct, it came from the Normans in particular, through the Norman establishment, through the Reformation, the Protestant work ethic, which meant robbing all the Catholic monasteries, through the Reformation. Is Britain a Protestant country any longer? Has that been successful? The force continues. It's a constant movement away from an idea of, being answerable to somebody. The empire grows in the United States, the city on the hill, Protestant thing. The Protestant thing becomes related to Israel, kind of spure, the idea of the rapture, etc., which grows up at the same time as the great game. The great game, the Brits love games. The great game is to control, from across the Pacific, across Central Europe. Yeah. In that, Crimea is critical. The Holy Land is the most critical in the Holy Land. Afghanistan. That's why they're fighting out there in this great game. It's still the
Mhm.
same great game. So they're sending 30,000 Irish fellas out to fight in the Crimean War, quite unbelievable, after the famine, fighting against Russia. They're still doing it, and they're destroying the country. There is no Israel without the British Empire.
Right.
It's ridiculous, a ridiculous proposition. And in fact, the United States, there's evidence that they had that on the map long before it came out. So that same dialogue. Afghanistan messing around. They're not messing around there to free women or whatever. It's the same. It's the
Laura
same.
Bush was not telling the truth, you're saying. Shocking.
Well, it's the same. But here's the point. A lot of Protestants are beginning to realize that they're against globalism because they know that it's wrong. But globalism and Protestantism have a very close connection. Again, going back to Switzerland and going back to the great cradle and crucible, the great Protestant Rome. And there is a very, very interesting connection. So they're looking at all these people. No, I find the analysis always the Jew. I find that really ridiculous. There's this, distinguishing between people who are Zionists and particularly Christian Zionists and blaming it. It's a classic argument that empires have used. I don't believe I've laid out a very specific pathology that explains and connects how these things are surrogates of the distributed commercial force. And Switzerland, in 10 years' time, it may not be as important because there's a movement towards the Gulf states, Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia. They're moving back home. They're moving back to Babylon. They want to, as H.G. Wells said, the center might be in Basra, which is why they're going. So again, there are places that are very inaccessible. If they don't want you to come there, you're not going there. Really. But it's shifting. It has different nodal points, including probably Shanghai and Beijing and other places. So the irony is that a lot of people that are anti-globalist from their Protestant perspectives should look again at the specific historical and forensic analysis. Now, my argument out of this is, I think Islam will be destroyed as well. It will be extended and then destroyed, as in a judo move where once they're fully extended, they will be destroyed unless there's a different accommodation for a particular historical period. The objective is to destroy all religion. The only solution is for people to come from their religious position, spiritual position, and to unite at a higher level and to have a ceasefire in relation to their differences. Not get involved, not criticize other people's religions. Understand that we're going to be set up against each other and begin to, and with any atheist, agnostics, whoever that say this is wrong, I don't understand it, but I'm against it, whatever group, to understand that things like humanism have been taken over. They were taken over in the 30s. Humanism was taken over to be something else. It's not what you think it is. Yeah. Euthanasia is not about helping the old 90-year-old woman that wants to pass on. It's not about that in pain. It's not about those things. Your humanism is not about those things. And the same thing, your religion and what you're told about God and all that is not about what you're being told about or how it's being caricatured. So, funny enough, in relation to the historical contribution of Catholicism, I didn't not start out, but a lot of it does have a rich history that does actually anticipate and contribute towards the explanation of some of these things. And in fact, the work, as I was saying, in the 19th century, when they were talking about the Antichrist, they were trying to say, well, what is the Antichrist? I've always said that you can't have an Antichrist until you have a system of the Antichrist. And the system of the Antichrist, I believe, are these networks. And then the Antichrist comes out of that network.
And that's what Soloviev says.
Interesting.
I have to drop. My daughter told me a Bono joke the other day.
Oh yeah, I didn't get back to Bono. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Here's my Bono joke.
Yeah.
My daughter told me, because what's the difference between God and Bono?
I don't know. Tell me the difference between God and Bono.
God doesn't walk around Dublin pretending he's Bono.
yeah. Well, let me get back to just to finish on the Bono point. So remember that after Iraq, in the context of Iraq war and all that kind of stuff, Bono and Geldof, don't get me going on them, said that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair were like Lennon and McCartney. you know,
Come on,
in
right.
in a legal world properly, we should be looking at war criminals.
Mhm.
Tony Blair, the war. This is what was invented by the Allies, the war of aggression.
Mhm.
You know, as an international crime that you know.
Mhm.
So in international law, this was how it was defined. The United States, Britain have been constantly involved in wars of aggression. They're still doing it, and they're using them to reshape the world. Why is, you know, they say, oh, well, you know, help the
Spreading
migrants and
democracy.
all the
Yeah.
countries have been doing that. They bombed Libya to let, you know, to let it's deliberate policy to change. As Peter Sutherland said in 2012, before the House of Lords, he says the United Kingdom is too homogenous. We have to change it. It has to become more heterogeneous. Of course, they want to make every place heterogeneous because then they can set the people against each other and they won't be able to rebel against this
That's
global governance
exactly
system.
preparata too.
You'll be living in the chaos. You'll be hoping that you'll be able to survive the day. You'll be forming alliances with other nutters out there that might preserve your life as you're resorting to cannibalism or whatever in the worst. You know, I mean, these are you can't create a chaotic situation and not expect these things to follow. You can't flood a place with people and expect not to. They know that they've done this. They've done this so often. So Bono was always around, friends with George Bush, friends with these people, doing his concerts. He's doing the propaganda. One time he's in favor of the woman in Burma, next time he's against her, pushing this issue, not critical about any of the things. He is a figurehead of the globalist situation. The One Foundation, one, you know, very involved in all these things. What's one? It's the one world. It's the one world, the Tower of Babylon, the one language. Deeply involved in this. Now, here's my difference with. Here's where I might challenge you, Michael. I think nearly the whole. I think the whole battery's nearly gone there. I think the whole music industry was a psyop. The whole lot of it. Really, the whole lot. The whole lot. I'd throw the whole lot of it out. There's a few that might get through as the exceptions to the rule. The whole setup was to change your view. What, again, is Bono's view about Ireland? This is not a rebel song. He meant it wasn't a rebel song. He doesn't have any allegiance.
The whole music thing is a psyop. Yeah.
I see in the paper he's buying a house in Los Angeles or something. You know, all these people say, "Oh, we love Ireland." I think they'll be deserting the sinking ship.
Absolutely.
They have
It was complete fraud, and part of my anger at him is because, you know, well, I hadn't paid attention to U2 really since the mid '80s, and then Bono shows it back up on the radar. Like, what's he hanging out with Bill Gates for? You know.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I didn't like them originally. I remember getting tickets to the concerts, and a lot of my friends liking them. I'm there from the start. I said no thanks, and a big concert. I said no thanks. I don't really like them. And then I was interested, and you know, and listened to the, you know, and liked the music at particular times. There's some great songs, and that, as you know, if you're I have some good songs, no question. But in relation to what they stand for, and looking at the associations and looking at the story doesn't make sense. You know, well, I came up with this. And looking at the stuff about the environment and looking at the cost of all this kind of stuff, it just doesn't make sense. Every time they got an option to be in favor of a globalist thing, they were in favor of it, and they are heavily invested. Now there is a possibility that a lot of these guys, or some of these guys, are just so either not very bright or bright but concentrated on the detail that they're not looking at the big issue. I don't believe that, actually.
Do you think there's anything to, let's just say, and I'm not saying this is comprehensive, nor is it pre-thought, but just these people, you know, just think of the U.S. military. There's something, I write a lot from, you know, a rootedness perspective when I write for Front Porch Republic, or I used to teach a college that used a writing course at college that used the theme of rootedness. But you get a sense that, you know, so many people these military families just move people by design, right? And you lose an attachment to place. And that you take somebody like Bono, take him out long enough. I just think we become conductors for this new type of message. And we lose our ability, we become non-conductors to a sense of place. And there could even be a guilt sensation by not betraying your hometown. Nobody has to necessarily live where they were born. But, the role of the earth, because I was thinking too, James, this would be, I had mentioned at a certain point, we'll have to end in about 15 minutes at the latest because I got to run to a funeral. But, some of my line of questioning, and I think that statement and what I might ask connect. But this Valentin Tomberg, he just talked about the degeneration of jurisprudence from coming from divine law to, a natural law, even down to just positive law. And now we just have mechanistic positive law. And that fits the framework of Sophia versus Ahriman quite well. But, lately, if we go back a few weeks, I've been, I think of Steiner, but I also think of like Owen Barfield, that somebody like a Tomberg could see nothing good about the French Revolution at the end of his career, nothing good about it. Whereas hierarchy, as I've been saying in recent episodes about like a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, even the first Middle Ages, hierarchy was implied. Michael spoke eloquently about how hierarchy can sneak into an otherwise harmless church conversation when it's had on church property. But so Barfield talked about almost a movement from hierarchy, and we think of Jordan Peterson, who would say if it worked great, the top would serve the lowest, and so forth. But still, I think it's just giving too much leeway to people battling it out, just eating only meat, and you still got to fight for the hierarchy. Owen Barfield talked about a whole new model, based on beauty, where the whole and the parts could relate. Look at the Sistine Chapel. You look at one part of a whole, and it implied, and we see that in holography. I have something of a question about, maybe the role of the French Revolution. We're starting to get divided between people who want to beat up on the whole thing, or was it a movement towards liberty, individual liberty and so forth? Because, as we move into this stuff, we're not looking for a great simplifying mechanism. And right now, I don't want to say great things about the French Revolution. You talked about Mary Godwin and Frankenstein and everything. If that sets you off for a little bit, I'd be interested in anything you say. I've been puzzling about that in my mind.
There's a number of things that come up. There is an argument that came from a lot of these guys that were suspicious about the revolutionary movements. The revolutionary movements, all these, the Illuminati and all that kind of stuff. And I was thinking about recently in relation to one of these guys who wrote about the Antichrist. And he said that he was talking about Fenianism and Irish republicanism, and that's something that I know about. But when he was talking about the Young Irelanders, I was thinking, well, actually, you had the Young Irelanders, Young Italians, all these groups that came up at the same time across Europe. And if you look at it, because what we have to explain as well is, when I talk to my relations that were out fighting and shooting and all this kind of stuff, going back to the War of Independence and in jail and all this kind of stuff. They were Catholic, fundamentally Catholic, and they were exercising the right of self-defense, and they were protecting, so classic just war kind of scenario, and the right to the freedom of the nation. Because when Christ says spread the gospel to the nations, there's still nations there. He didn't say spread it to, So, but of course, in the last few decades, and particularly from the 90s, the Republican movement became Marxist. It could have happened before. That was taken over. There's arguments about whether that was because it was being run by the British and Americans. You might think that's strange, but there's a fair degree of that. But there's no question they were Marxists. And talking to people I talked to and looking at the books they were reading, they were international Marxists, a number of them. And then there was the Catholics that didn't realize that the thing had been taken over, by the thing. So then the question is, are all these movements, all these revolutionary movements, false? And there's a possibility that the answer to that is yes. And that's
to be baptized is another relevant question, though. I see too many people rejecting liberty because so much of it has gotten co-opted, where it's possible the real thing for me is we got to baptize that. There's no going back. Walt Whitman, Goethe, there was this thing. It was beautiful. It's there in Shelley. Some of that is very stirring, I think, if we allow our humanity to speak. But I'm just not sure, and I'm not even sure of my question. Okay.
So that's why my belief is that there has to be mass movements of individuals who are not in structures, because the structure, the entity can become the dominant thing in their control. That's what because if we say about this liberty came from this political ideology, in most cases it didn't. They came from
and England is a quite different example, as Burke showed.
Yeah, and Burke and another Dublin, etc. And also, if we think of Mary Shelley, she's also coming from a context where the Luddites are protesting against technology. We had all these things going on. There was all these forces coming, which can't be simplified, because the winners always say, "Well, look what we did. You know, we had this. It was us that gave you that liberty, and us." And the concepts of liberty, and as Illich talked about, the concept of life and that, they didn't come from there. We go back to the Magna Carta. When the Magna Carta, when they're fighting against the king, the objective is to maintain power. So they're saying, hold on, whereas the barons are asserting their right. They didn't come from this is a false narrative. And this is, I forget what his name is, I keep saying Sutherland, his name will come back to me, a professor who explained who realized that the theory that Marx was using, his jurisprudential theory, was flawed because he hadn't looked at the long legal history of Britain, and that these rights went back earlier on. They were there before. I'll give you an example. I was listening to a Muslim scholar talking about rights in the West and claiming that they didn't have human rights and all this kind of stuff. Otherwise, he was good on it. But in 697, Adam Naun had an international convention in Ireland to protect the rights of vulnerable women and children in war. In 697, before so the concept of the Brehon law, which existed in Ireland before the common law system ever happened, had a system of compensation if you're injured in the blacksmith. We could tell this was what the family had to pay. So these the idea that they were invented by later on the concept of liberty is a false narrative, right. And they didn't get more liberty after that. So in relation to and you talk about Sophia, it's interesting as a matter of interpretation and hermeneutics, the whole lot, how we interpret things. I'm fascinated again with different Catholic, Protestant, or how we interpret sacred scripture, and it's very, very interesting in the Marian apparitions. That a thing that comes to me is, so of course, the Virgin Mary is criticizing the church, and she's saying they're leading you to hell. You know, the priests, or some of the priests, bishops, and we take Garabandal and cardinals, are on the road to perdition. And this goes back to La Salette. It goes through nearly all of them. And she says, listen to what my son says. And I think that's critical. Listen to what my son says. So, as a mediatrix, the rule of interpretation and the logos, is saying, look at what Jesus said. And that, for me, takes away much of the stuff that's projected onto it. Much of the stuff, you know, so when you're talking to Protestant person sometimes, and there's an awful lot of Old Testament stuff, and you say, hold on a second, but did you not hear about Christ coming, to what about that thing? And the Virgin Mary and the Sophia kind of element as well says, look at this thing. And that also, the idea of the remoteness, the apparitions in the hills, in the mountains, away from the center, close to nature, is in some way, for me, an indication of the next phase. It's the next phase of the post-centralized thing, where it will be different. And even, I suppose, the concept of the rosary and that is concentrated thing that you can do on your own, that has its power in the thing. So beautiful. I appreciate the advances, but how is all these advances that we suppose, all these progressions, all these liberties, they don't exist. They can lock you down. Who would have thought that these liberties would mean that they could lock you down in your house for months and give you injections and whatever like that, and all that kind of stuff? And they're going to do it again? Where are all these people who have these liberty? They were telling you to be locked up. They were telling you you should be in a concentration camp. This is what these libertarian, or the people with a certain concept of liberty, were saying. I don't believe
where is the people who are speaking eloquently of liberty now, like yourself? Where are they getting their juice? Are they getting it from like the Catholic Church? Like, is there something of a commonality? Those that have tried to preserve their language of liberty, so we can distinguish between the Magna Carta and, say, the French Revolution. But there's something about the land that I think is implied here. And I'd be interested in the question of those who kind of survived. Michael mentioned Naomi Wolf. Where did these people take their cues? Some of this American instinct, just these kind of randos, the hated white working class. there's something pretty neat, and they're not going back to even despite their claims of Christianity, I'm trying to figure out their fuel a little bit. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, no, I was going to say is what James is talking about here. That's precisely the take home from Novalis's Christendom or Europe.
Say more.
Is that what it's, it was interpreted by a lot of people at the time, and in fact, it wasn't even published for the longest time after he died, because they thought it was kind of a reactionary return to Catholicism and the Pope and hierarchy, which it wasn't. What it was a return to was a small is beautiful Christianity.
And that's what you're saying in
I
James.
think the ancient Celtic church was a great example of that, because, as I said, it was close to nature. There were no urban centers. Hierarchy had a much looser relationship to the faithful, and it was so far from Rome that they didn't even know the Pope existed, so which allowed it to grow organically in a wholesome way.
Yeah.
And it was only later, after the ecclesial power structure had a stronger system is the word, right, that Ireland changed.
James, take us home for 5 minutes or so. Yeah, you can kind of close out. We will gather.
Okay.
But yeah.
So I come from a Catholic background, and I still think it's very relevant. I mean, I fell out of love with it for a long period of time, but when you come back to it more violent in a kind of not saying I'm back in the thing, but towards it and towards it's understanding it, and I've never relinquished my attachment to I'm going to call it pagan, to the land, to the deep sense. But it was there in early Catholicism. It was there in Erugain in the 9th century.
Absolutely.
There, like Taoism. Now, when I talk to my old relations who never, gave up the thing or never would, they were attached to the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit was the thing.
Very interesting.
And the Holy Spirit was. And when I went to Garabandal and I met Jacinta, and she presented a cross to me, and so I was trying to concentrate on what I perceive when she presented a cross to me, because this is a cross that's supposedly kissed by the Virgin Mary. And what struck me in that was I did have a definite feeling or sensation or ontologically real thing, and it was that all of this stuff is above words. It's a power, it's a force. I know it sounds simple. We know that ineffability, but this is the whole holy force. I think Irish people had that, and I think you could see it in their eyes up till recently. I'm seriously mean that. When Irish eyes smile, it meant something, because they did have this deep spiritual tradition. That's why Gramsci realized you could never talk the Catholics into a materialist workers' paradise, because they wouldn't give up their eternal soul for it. Now they're making a pact. They're making a Mephistophelian pact. It won't be as good as Goethe. It'll be the Christopher Marlowe version. Last point. The film The Field with Richard Harris, I mentioned before, not a great film for a number of reasons. I've written about it. And the article I read about, the guy said it was the best, who wrote the original play said it was the best thing written about it. But so I accepted that as triangulation of its sense. When they came to film this field with Richard Harris, they used a field that my grandfather used to mind sheep in. So the actual field, my grandfather's uncle owned, and he was there minding sheep. So I mean, it kind of has a deep connection in that. I used to camp in that field when I was going off one of my own. So I do feel an affinity. There's a few interesting statements in the play. They're successful. The local community get rid of this outsider who was actually a returning Irish. It's an interesting story to it. In the film, it's an American who wants to come around and have a quarry, and they turn it into something like a King Lear tragedy, because they didn't want to support the IRA and the US. They made a strategic error. But Richard Harris was great in the film. Richard Harris holds up a stick when the man is talking about the law, and he says, "And I've held that stick because it was a stick belonging to a relation of mine." And he says something like, "You don't understand, Yank. This is the law. The stick, force." That's what Mao Zedong says. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Ultimately, we're talking about a battle of force. The authority
Mhm.
to make rules comes from who has the power to do so, the military
Yeah,
force
right,
to
right,
make
right.
the laws. That's why there's no international law that brings these, the Atlantis criminals to court, because
Mhm.
they are the ones that are making
Make
the
the
rules.
law.
They set
Yeah.
they set the game up. And also in that was a deep attachment, which I related to the indigeneity of the Irish people, that they had that connection to that land for hundreds of years. Now, this generation and other countries have said, you have no right to that land. You have
Mhm.
no right, you don't have any attachment to that land, and you can fuck off, basically.
Mhm. Yeah.
And the Irish people have some way accepted that. And they say, well, because your families were scattered all around the world, you have to take in other people and fuck off again. Sorry to use the language,
Yeah,
but,
yeah,
but
no, it's
really,
fine. Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
really,
Use
this
that
is what
language.
it is. Okay, I've accepted that. That's the way it is. I don't want to be using bad language on your thing, but that's
It's so fine.
literally
So
what
fine.
the consequences of it is. And I've accepted that. The people have chosen that. They've made that Mephistophelian pact with the people that are telling them that. It's a big lie. It's a rejection of the connection with the land. It's a rejection of the connection with God. And they're going to suffer from it. They're not going to suffer just one generation in the short term. They'll suffer, if you believe in a much deeper sense, because of the connection with rejection of who they are, rejection of a connection with the land, rejection of a connection with the divine source, believing that you're a materialist being. They're selling you that thing. They're selling you that vision. It's now they're trying to do that to everybody on there.
Mhm.
So Ireland is lost in that context. It's not going to get it back. It's too late in many senses to recover that, unless they
Mm.
have something like a new Israel, which brings back all the diaspora in the future. But really, really, it's the key element is that this force of the Holy Spirit, whatever way you want to interpret that, is a direct force that operates on you as an individual, that you have gnosis about, that this is a real thing. It's not a
Yeah,
thing
right.
written in thing. It's a real force that connects you to the land, that connects you to your people, that connects you to community, connects you to other people, not just a stranger coming in. Of course, Christianity is based on loving the stranger, but you don't bring in an NGO to help the man and as a good Samaritan or the person that's sick. You do it
Mhm.
yourself, but you don't relinquish. You don't sacrifice. You can sacrifice yourself, no greater love, but you don't sacrifice all the people around you. You don't sacrifice your children to a
Amen.
medical establishment. You don't
Mhm.
sacrifice your family. You don't sacrifice your community. You don't sacrifice your country to this manipulated vision that's suiting the Promethean forces. So the
Mhm.
Holy
James
Spirit
Tunney. Yeah.
is there. The Holy
Mhm.
Spirit is there. It's a real thing. It's
Yeah.
ontologically real, and it will persist after you die. In my belief, that is my belief. It's above the pointers in the words. The words are insufficient, as we know, to point to the logo. They're only pointing to it. But don't point in the wrong direction, and don't go off in the wrong direction, and don't be convinced that you're merely a liability by misanthropic people who are running a mechanistic system that wants to destroy you, your family, your heritage, to own, and turn you into a butterfly, as Elon Musk says. So
Mhm.
Wow.
that's the end of it. I know you have to go.
James Tunney. James
Apologies for the
Tunney.
strong language, but
No, no,
sometimes you
no.
have to
What a
express
great
yourself.
ending. It was symphonic in its ending. And the great news is it's an ending without an ending, because James Tunney, I
Right.
hope this conversation, which is always ongoing, continues.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you,
Great.
everybody, for
And
listening to the
thank you for your
Regeneration
time. I
podcast.
appreciate that. And good
Absolutely.
luck. Great to talk to you,
Yeah.
Michael and Mike. And I really enjoyed the conversation.
God bless
to
you
see you.
both, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Okay. God
Bye.
bless.